The Heroes Cemetery in Bucharest, where those who died in the revolution 5 years ago are buried. Nowadays, it all seems so clear-cut. The people rose up and overthrew their oppressors. Yet it wasn't really that simple. For a start, those who died were mostly killed by so-called friendly fire. But there was more to the Romanian Revolution than just a mass uprising. There was a carefully organized plot against Ceausescu as well, with full Russian knowledge. Yet many of those who were at the chaotic first secret meeting of the Revolutionary Committee disagree on how the revolution itself came about.
It could not be organized. It should be preferably if there could be this possibility, but it was not done. It was a spontaneous rising of the people.
Another leading figure makes it clear that the National Salvation Front, the group they formed, wasn't spontaneous at all. It had been going on long before the revolution.
The National Salvation Front wasn't just functioning for 6 months, but since the winter of 1984. If you want to call it a plot, well, it's okay by me.
Others who were at the meeting say it was more complicated than that. So that when President Iliescu says, you just came there by chance, no organization, no planning, he's absolutely right, is he?
Partly.
Well, he's either right or wrong. I mean, you either have an organization or you don't have an organization.
On this point, he is right. But on the point that there were no plans for a conspiracy, on this point, he is not right.
As for Ceausescu's family, they think they know exactly who was behind it all.
Why was he removed? It was inevitable after the way things have been going all over the former Soviet bloc. It was very clear Moscow felt that he was undesirable.
We'll look in greater detail at each of those arguments in a moment. But what's certain is that Nicolae Ceausescu, heavily influenced by his wife Elena, had created all the circumstances for a revolution against himself. He'd cut people's living standards savagely in his efforts to pay off Romania's foreign debt, and his secret police, the Securitate, had become so repressive that people were goaded beyond all measure and came out in open rebellion. The uprising in the town of Timișoara earlier in the week had seriously alarmed Ceausescu. He decided to reassert his authority by calling a big rally of his supporters outside the Central Committee building in Bucharest. It backfired terribly. Among the loyalists gathered below, there were one or two political dissidents who knew that this was Ceausescu's moment of weakness. As he spoke from the balcony, the entire revolution was sparked off by one particularly courageous man, Nica Leon.
I shouted, "Long live Timișoara, down with the killer." The people around me, and there were a lot of them, didn't immediately realize what was going on. They thought I was a party activist, and that this was the slogan to shout. But when they heard me yell, "Down with Ceausescu," they could see I was actually against what was going on in the square. They were terrified they might be fired on, so they started to run for it.
The cameras, of course, ignore the chaos, but people are now dropping their banners and the wooden supports are getting snapped in the crush. It sounds like firecrackers or gunshots. People start to scream. They think it's another massacre like Timișoara. Ceausescu's voice trails away. The rally continues, but throughout Romania, people now know that Ceausescu's authority is under direct challenge. Nowadays, many of the top figures under Ceausescu have gone into big business. Among them, the smooth, aristocratic General Victor Stanculescu, a friend of the Ceausescu clan, who nevertheless played a key part in the revolution. From his expensive headquarters in Bucharest, he runs things in imperial fashion. 5 years ago, with a crisis developing, he knew that Ceausescu's political future was in the balance. He needed a breathing space to see what would happen. So he pretended he'd broken his leg, and he had it set in plaster.
It was a solution that enabled me to be a few hours late before I arrived at the Central Committee building. I managed to persuade Ceausescu and his wife to leave the building, telling them that this was the way to save themselves. In fact, I was trying to prevent a confrontation between his bodyguards, who were heavily armed, and the unarmed people who were trying to get into the Central Committee building.
Some of the revolutionaries had already made it onto the roof of the Central Committee building, just as the Ceausescus and a few of their panic-stricken followers were getting into a helicopter. Ceausescu was certain by now that all this was a Russian plot against him, and he headed off to the northwest, in the direction he'd always planned to take if the Russians invaded his country. So Ceausescu had escaped, only to be captured later that day in the town of Târgoviște. Into the power vacuum here at the Central Committee building rushed a motley group of revolutionaries, from university professors to artists and petty criminals. There was even a circus stuntman among them. The stuntman's name was Dan Iosif. He was a man of considerable intelligence and charisma. Now, as he addressed the crowd from the balcony, people encouraged him to proclaim himself president. In this extraordinary, overcharged atmosphere, the crowd might even have agreed. But he didn't do it. Nowadays, he's a presidential advisor, not a job with much power, but perhaps a way of saying thank you to him.
No,
I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry, and I don't think I'll ever regret it in the future. Because on that night of December the 22nd, I said to myself, a shoemaker has destroyed Romania, meaning Ceausescu, and a working man shouldn't and couldn't take the job on now. I'm telling you straight.
Outside, the speakers were still struggling for the microphone on the balcony, and the crowd was as ecstatic as ever. But by now, any real power the revolutionaries who had taken over the Central Committee building might have had largely evaporated. Instead, it had shifted to a small, windowless room inside the building. There, a group of former Communist Party members had gathered. Many of them had held high office under Ceausescu. No one took much notice of the uninvited amateur cameraman who'd come into the room and had started filming them. But this video material, which has now been made available to the BBC, strongly suggests that, far from being a purely spontaneous gathering, there was clear planning behind it all. In other words, a degree of organization stretching back for some time. The youngish man on the left didn't start out as a member of the group. Petre Roman, an academic whose father had been a famous communist, had come charging into the building with a crowd of revolutionaries earlier in the day. But he was an impressive figure and was quickly selected to become the new prime minister.
At that moment, I didn't notice that I was the only one coming from the street. And all the others were former politicians.
Did that make you wonder why they were there and how they'd got there?
The truth is quite simple. It was a vacuum of power. And as all politicians, and very good politicians, they knew that this is a very good moment to be there.
The dominant figure at this secret meeting was Ion Iliescu. For several years, he'd been regarded as a possible successor to Ceausescu, but after falling foul of Elena Ceausescu, he'd been forced out of political life. By general consent, he was the leader. And nowadays, as president, he dislikes any suggestion that he might have got there as a result of a conspiracy.
I came to the former Central Committee at 5 o'clock, but there was full of people, thousands of people meeting there. So there was a spontaneous group, many people. We did not know each each other very well, only some of them.
In fact, it's hard to find anyone here who didn't know each other beforehand. A Marxist intellectual who'd once been a Stalinist hardliner, Silviu Brucan, had just arrived. Until that morning, he'd been under house arrest. He'd been out of political life for months.
The theory of conspiracy, coup d'etat, which was very à la mode in the French press and probably in the British press also, looks very attractive for newspapermen, but doesn't hold water.
But despite what Silviu Brucan says, the brooding figure of General Nicolae Militaru, regarded as pro-Russian, was there because he had been involved in a conspiracy against Ceausescu. It had begun in earnest 6 months before, and the plan was to stage a coup in February 1990. Ceausescu was to be taken prisoner while he was holidaying somewhere outside Bucharest. His guards would be put out of action with tranquilizer guns. But the guns weren't due to be delivered until January 1990, the month after the revolution actually broke out. Militaru and the other conspirators had been overtaken by events.
Don't be surprised if Mr. Brucan says nothing was planned. He doesn't know. No doubt Mr. Iliescu will say the same thing. He still doesn't admit it, even now.
Situația a fost cu totul alta.
Was Iliescu part of the plot?
Absolut. Absolut.
Absolutely, he says. In the meeting, there was a big argument about what name to give the group they were in the process of forming. General Militaru and most of the others want to call it the National Salvation Front. Petre Roman, the outsider, objects. That sounds like hell, he says, meaning it smacks too much of communism. Then General Militaru lets the cat out of the bag. Look, my dear chaps, he says, the National Salvation Front has been in existence for 6 months. By blurting this out, General Militaru is confirming that there was indeed a long-standing conspiracy involving several of the people here. The man who made this video available to us was called a traitor for allowing it to be known publicly. It undermined the accepted view of the revolution.
Iliescu agreed with the name National Salvation Front from the very beginning, long before the revolution. He was the one who had the idea of writing a manifesto to a foreign radio station using the front's name.
I don't think the revolution could be by somebody confiscated. There is another formula, that the Romanian revolution was confiscated by somebody, by Iliescu and his friends. It is a non-realistic and non-political, non-scientific approach to a social process.
The fundamental question is whether these men, all of them former communists, had come together in order to take charge of the revolution and turn Romania into a reformist, pro-Russian communist state. Naturally enough, they strongly deny it nowadays. Yet whatever the people in here wanted scarcely mattered. It was abundantly clear by now that the vast crowds outside, the people who had actually made the revolution, wouldn't stand for anything less than a complete end to communism. And they got their way. In the 5 years since all this, the Soviet Union itself has ceased to exist. We went to Tbilisi in Georgia, now independent, to find out how much Soviet involvement there'd been in the Romanian Revolution. We'd come to see the Georgian president, Edward Shevardnadze, the Soviet foreign minister at the time. He and Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to get rid of the old hardline communists in Eastern Europe.
All these leaders had to go, especially Ceausescu. I remember the last Congress of the Romanian Communist Party, a month before the revolution, which Gorbachev attended. He stayed there for 2 days. Gorbachev told me he talked with them into the early hours of the morning. and the discussion almost turned into a fight, so that the security men outside were alerted. Gorbachev came back with a terrible impression of the place. He said Ceausescu simply didn't understand what was going on in the real world.
Is it possible that the KGB played a part in the revolution in Romania?
The KGB is a service where no one knows exactly what's going on behind the scenes. It's possible there was something, but to organize everything that happened in Romania was beyond the KGB's capacity. This was a real expression of popular protest against the regime.
Still, thanks to General Militaru, the Russians knew all about the anti-Ceausescu conspiracy.
20 august 1987.
On August the 20th, 1987, in the morning, I went to the Soviet consulate in Constanța and talked to the consul general. He knew exactly what I wanted. I asked him if there happened to be a movement to get rid of Ceausescu, how would the Soviet Union react? The consul went out. I waited for 15 or 20 minutes, which seemed like hours, and then he came back and he said, "Comrade Militaru, the Soviet Union does not interfere in the domestic affairs of Romania." I realized the message was, do whatever you think you need to.
In the lift at a big hotel in Bucharest, the Ceausescu's nephew has come to meet us. Emil Barbulescu is tense, insecure, and still quite young. Even so, Ceausescu made him one of the most senior officers in the Securitate. He's certain the Russians helped to overthrow his uncle.
He never agreed with anything Gorbachev said. If Gorbachev said something was white, Ceausescu would say, no, it's black. Gorbachev couldn't take that indefinitely. Ceausescu would have fallen anyway, though maybe not in December '89. But I think the meeting he had with Gorbachev was very important. Ceausescu was very tough there. He made territorial claims, he demanded the return of Romanian treasure from Moscow, and he accused Gorbachev directly of betraying communism. I think this hastened the process.
SRI is the Romanian Information Service, the cleaned-up security organization which took over from Ceausescu's hated Securitate. The SRI's headquarters, which we were the first television team to visit, is nicknamed Twin Peaks, after the bizarre American television series because it contains so many unexplained mysteries. Its director, who took part in the conspiracy against Ceausescu, now has details of what the Russians did.
We have information that proves this involvement took place, though it didn't have a decisive effect on the way things turned out. There weren't very many of them, but it was clear at the time that the Soviet special services, the KGB, were concentrating their efforts not just to find out what was going on in Romania, but also to carry out diversions against the former regime.
At precisely 7 o'clock on the evening of the day Ceausescu fled and was captured, the counter-revolution began. The firing was carried out by small groups loyal to Ceausescu, members of his bodyguard and other special forces, not all of them Romanian. They poured fire into the crowds, and the shooting went on for most of the night. These are thought to be the only pictures of the Ceausescu loyalists as they sniped at the crowds, operating under an instruction known as 2600, which was to take effect if there were a serious uprising or an invasion. They were told to create maximum terror. Now, though, the army had joined the revolutionaries, there was serious bloodshed as a result, since the soldiers were careless and panic-stricken and blazed away at anything that moved. 1,000 people died, 13,000 were injured, the great majority of them the victims of their own side. But when the Ceausescus were given their summary trial on Christmas Day, any resistance by the loyalists collapsed. There was no point in fighting now. Ceausescu rasps his fury at his accusers.
Care a organizat lovitura de stat cu concursul agenturilor străine.
But the Drumhead Tribunal, partly organized by their family friend, the elegant and subtle General Stanculescu, ground on.
It wasn't necessarily the intention to execute the two of them. If they accepted the two propositions, their defense lawyer, first to agree that they were mentally ill and needed treatment, and secondly, that they would appeal against their sentence. But they turned both of these things down. Maybe they thought they wouldn't be executed right away, or maybe they thought some other force would save them at the last moment.
Ceausescu tells the judges, whoever organized this coup can shoot whoever they want. Then he turns to Mrs. Ceausescu and quotes from a 19th century Romanian poet. It's better that we should die fighting in full glory than be slaves in our ancient land. And yet they've shrunk from being absolute rulers to an old fractious couple who still don't realize they're about to be taken out to their deaths. It's only a few minutes away now.
Their last walk was very short. We took them to a blank wall with no windows, where they were executed.
The firing squad panicked and didn't wait for orders.
Firing was intense. They were using automatic weapons, which knocked the Ceausescus down. I doubt if this last tragic moment lasted more than 20 to 30 seconds.
The video, when shown in its full, unpleasant detail, proves that the more fanciful theories, that the Ceausescus were shot in the back of the neck elsewhere and their bodies brought here, were unfounded. But was it really right to have executed them?
Yes. It's a cynical description of the situation, but that Stalin used to say, if you are afraid of the wolf, don't go into the forest.
It left a really bad impression on me, all this, a bad impression. Especially since Ceausescu wasn't the only one who was involved. I don't know if it can be justified.
Five years on, they're busy restoring all the buildings damaged in the fighting. The process of healing is well underway in Romania. The economy may not be strong, but people can get decent clothes and decent food. The mood has lightened. The old climate of fear has disappeared. It's starting to look like a country which might well join the European Union at some point.
This country is now in possession of the most important democratic institutions. But the democratic functioning of these institutions is far from being achieved. And sometimes, especially now, sometimes I feel that we are sometimes going back to the same mentality.
Ceausescu's grave, marked unnecessarily and quite untruthfully as unknown, has become a place of slightly furtive pilgrimage. Yet not many people go to visit his wife's grave 20 yards away and also marked unknown. It seems as though all the blame for what they did together has now been shifted onto her alone. In 5 years, everything has changed. The Soviet Union, which Ceausescu feared so much and blamed perhaps correctly for his downfall, has collapsed. Communism itself is discredited. And, strangest metamorphosis of all, the great dictator is starting to be regarded as a hero. Who's buried here? Asks the little boy. His parents answer, the greatest leader in Romania.